From KQED Public Radio in San Francisco, I'm Michael Krasny. Good morning and welcome to this morning's forum. Christopher Hitchens, trailblazing journalist, contrarian, and self-proclaimed Protestant atheist and infidel, has recently published a book titled God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. In it, if I dare call him a crusader, Hitchens takes on God and religion with the religious zeal he displayed in his polemics against Clinton, Henry Kissinger, and Mother Teresa. He calls religion an original sin and a form of child abuse and takes us back to the genesis of his iconoclastic ideas as a 9-year-old skeptical English child. Religion, Hitchens finally concludes, has run out of justifications. Thanks to the telescope and the microscope, it no longer offers an explanation of anything important. His brief against God is a strong one and a defiant one. And let me tell you a little bit about Christopher Hitchens, who's been on the show a number of times. He is contributing editor to Vanity Fair, visiting professor of liberal studies at the New School, writes for many publications, including Slate, London Review of Books, Atlantic Monthly, and the Times Literary Supplement. And other books of his include Letters to a Young Contrarian and Why Orwell Matters. And he joins us for this hour of forum. Good to see you again.
Very nice of you to have me back.
Well, where do we begin with this exegetical work of yours, hermeneutical work? Actually, you know where I'd like to begin? A little bit with the language, because I was looking at some of the reviews, and one of the reviews in Esquire said, thank God for Christopher Hitchens. Somehow when you talk about God, you wind up often using that kind of language. You use the word soul, for example.
Yes.
And you even at one time use the word evil in a way that's associated perhaps with religion when you talk about the Old and New Testament. You can't avoid those signifiers.
No, I don't think one can. There's no point in trying to do so. First, they're very important in the vernacular and in the idiom. And second, I think the word evil does describe something real, palpable. In fact, I've often thought it'd be a lot easier to argue for the existence of the devil than it would be for the existence of God. There's more proof of the devil's activity on earth than of any divine
The palpability of evil.
Yes. I've often felt I can actually touch it. And I tried once to...
Some see you as the consummate example of it now, I suspect.
Well, bear in mind that you're talking to someone who has, I think, a distinction no one else can claim, which is I was asked by the Vatican to testify against the canonization of Mother Teresa, and accepted. And as not everyone knows, the last Pope abolished the office of devil's advocate. They don't have a devil's advocate anymore because they like to fast-track their saints. So it suddenly hit me that I was representing the devil pro bono, and I must be the only person ever to have done that.
Well, let me be a little bit of an angel's advocate here, at least what in common parlance would be described as an angel's advocate, and be the contrarian a little bit with you. There is a sense, there's a whole chapter about religion doesn't allow us to behave better, which I found myself interested in, particularly since you describe a Sudanese taxicab driver who was kind enough, and based presumably on his Islamic faith, to return money that your wife had left in his taxicab. And I thought to myself, there are people who act in goodwill and do good acts of good because they feel it's their religious duty to do those acts.
Yes, but And that's what the man said when he brought the money back. He could easily have kept it, as he would have had to know. We wouldn't have been able to trace him. He drove a long way back into town.
Went to some trouble,
having kindly worked out who it must have been that he dropped off, who'd left the money, and found us and handed it over. Wouldn't take... I knew it was a mistake to offer, but I felt I had to offer him 10%. He wouldn't take it. It was clearly slightly insulted by the idea. Said, no, it's my Muslim duty. A nice little story, as you might say. But I still think that religion degrades our altruistic impulses, because I would have done that, actually, and so would you. And we would have done it out of humanism and out of solidarity, because we would have hoped that the same thing would be done if it was our money. To say, well, God made me do it, is to suggest that you believe that you're going to go to heaven if you do the right thing, and you're going to go to hell if you do the wrong thing. Now, I think that's a degradation of altruism and of humanism.
And yet, I was thinking about...
That's why I say religion poisons everything, because even in the most intimate exchanges that can make human life possible, society possible, it's there with its rewards and punishments and its terrifying rhetoric and its inducements as well.
You want a kind of pure altruism that's humanistic, but the fact is, I keep thinking about all these convicts, for example, who find religion, and then suddenly they really do change their behavior. And one could argue, and I think I've heard the argument that, in fact, there's more reform because of religion in prison than just about any single factor, that it is a godsend. Dare I use that?
Well, if you credit that, which I know there's strong evidence for it, then you have to say that the Nation of Islam, for example, is as good as anybody else, perhaps even better, because they do a lot of this. They get people off drugs, apparently, and into their cult organization, by the way. There's a lot of proselytizing now of different kinds of Islam in the prison system, which I'm not sure we'll find is absolutely guaranteed to produce altruistic people, by the way.
Actually, there was a new poll.
But
which
fine,
you probably saw.
Scientology makes the same claims of people. It doesn't say anything about the value or the truth claims of these cults, though.
I was just going to footnote a new poll that showed that Muslims were asked about their sympathy for Muslims throughout America for al-Qaeda, and there were a significant number of black Muslims who felt somewhat sympathetic toward, or even more than somewhat sympathetic. What about when you look back historically, though, at the abolition movement, and you look back at the civil rights movement? You write very favorably about Martin Luther King, even emotionally and poignantly about Martin Luther King. And the argument is often made that there really wouldn't have been the force or the passion behind those movements had it not been for religion.
Yes, but that's my critique of him, because if you remember, I'm sure you do in fact remember, in his lifetime, before he became the plaster saint that he's become since, he was attacked very venomously by the right wing, by the establishment, and particularly by the FBI, for the number of secular friends, atheist, communist, socialist friends that he had in his circle, which indeed he did. He'd himself been a student of Marx and Hegel at university. These people had already made the case for civil rights. You don't need a supernatural justification for saying that racial discrimination isn't allowed in American law, let alone in voting. Bayard Rustin, for example, great black secularist, and Philip Randolph, the guys who actually organized the March on Washington, didn't use religious rhetoric. The fact that King was able to use religious rhetoric, which was the most common rhetoric in the South, the only book everyone had in common, was obviously a great tactical advantage. But it's just as well he wasn't a real believer, because his metaphor was Exodus and the wanderings of the oppressed. Well, if you follow the Exodus model, they're entitled to kill every other tribe, enslave its survivors, rape their women, and take their land, which is not what Dr. King was preaching. If he really had been a Christian taking Exodus as his text, you should have watched out. This is a very evil book, a really, really seriously wicked book. So I think there's a lot to be said on that side of the case, and I'd add one more thing, which is that this assumption made by a lot of liberals that, well, somehow black politics requires the pulpit. We give it to them. We even credit the whole civil rights movement to the religious and faith-based, has meant since then that black America has been led largely by frauds and charlatans, like Jackson and Sharpton. And because they've got Reverend in front of their names, people think they must be the spokesman for black America. And this is appallingly condescending. Talking
to Christopher Hitchens, and his new book is, looking at the title here, this is, of course, in the Galley God, in very small letters, is not great, and how religion poisons everything. There seems to be a kind of a zeitgeist of atheism now. I know you kind of write a little sneeringly about these brights, as they call themselves, Dennett and Dawkins, but Sam Harris, I mean, there seems to be a crew out there. This is not something you align yourself with, I know, but...
Oh, please, no, don't say I speak slightingly, except in that respect, of Dawkins and Dennett. I've got a huge admiration for them, and I'm very much in their debt for their sort of path-breaking work. I do think it was an appalling idea to propose that we atheists or anti-theists call ourselves brights, but that was by way of showing that we're not a united front. But we are we're increasingly being written up as four musketeers, and that's very flattering to me. And I think you're right. I think zeitgeist is exactly the right word. There is a detectable turn now, I think, against religious bullying, clerical harassment. You can find it everywhere I've been on this tour, and the book is now number one on the New York Times bestseller list. And it's not because of my blue eyes. It's because people are fed up. You turn the page of a newspaper, and if it's not the parties of God reducing Iraq to ruins and destroying Iraqi society, it's the Iranian mullahs with their tooth fairy belief in a hidden imam who's about to return, now with additional illegal nuclear weapons added to the mix. Thanks a lot. In this country, religious idiots trying to impose stultification on American schools by the teaching of pseudoscience under the fatuous name of intelligent design, creationism in other words. The Pope saying, okay, all those children we said had gone to limbo because they weren't baptized. That wasn't true. But let's talk more about hell. And while we're on the subject, AIDS in Africa is bad, but condoms are much worse. It's unbelievable. George Bush saying God bless America the entire time.
But what about
I think people are fed up with it, and they think, well, we used to think we could take the Enlightenment for granted, and our First Amendment privileges. Now we have to fight for them.
There are many enlightened religious people, though. In fact, they call in this program all the time, and they say, we don't identify with that kind of fundamentalism or extremism or the kinds of things that you're talking about.
Well, then they should stop waving these texts, which are the license for all this stuff. They should. Why do they bother to say they're religious in that case?
Because they are people of faith. You talk about Kierkegaard and the leapfrogging of faith. These are people who have made the leap, and they are there.
Well, I have to say I suspect it. I get it all the time, of course. I have to write a different book for every person. I couldn't just attack religion because no one really believes in it anymore. You say to someone, did you say you were a Catholic? Yes. Well, what about the virgin birth? Well, I don't really believe in that. You don't? It used to be very dangerous to be a Catholic and say you doubted that. But by what authority, by the way, do you doubt it? Are you just taking religion a la carte? If so, why am I supposed to be impressed?
Can't you be enlightened?
Why can't they just get rid of it?
An enlightened a la carte believer?
No, I don't believe so. No, because this stuff either is or is not the Word of God and divinely inspired and revealed to us. If it isn't, if you don't believe that, I don't really see by what warrant you say you're religious. I had a debate with a Baptist in North Carolina the other night, and I said, so you're a Calvinist? Yes. Well, can I just ask you in front of these good people, do you believe that I or anyone else is going to hell? He wouldn't answer, didn't want to say, not in front of an educated audience. But I said, if you say yes, I have another question for you. If you say no, I'd like to know on what authority you say that Calvin got it all wrong, and in what way you're a Baptist. The fact that a lot of people do find religious precepts to be unbelievable and don't really subscribe to them is surely a point for me rather than against me.
Thinking about the transatlantic difference that we find, given your background, so many Brits do not believe in heaven and hell, at least disproportionately, dramatically different than the number of Americans who do. It's just fascinating to think about that. And you, although you may be in the company of people like Dawkins and Dennett and Sam Harris, nevertheless are sui generis. In fact, this goes back to 9-year-old. I mean, you give us this kind of autobiographical material, which I found fascinating. A 9-year-old skeptic you were, you know?
Yeah. I think lots of people have this.
Thanks to Mrs. Watts, right?
The lovely old Mrs. Watts, who was shall I tell the story?
Of course.
I'll try and condense it.
It's a lovely story. Yeah.
When I was a little 9-year-old boy in my shorts and sandals in Dartmoor in Devon, very beautiful part of England, Mrs. Watts was our nature walk teacher. She would show us the different kinds of birds and plants and trees and flowers. And she combined this role with being our scripture teacher. The teaching of Christianity is mandatory in English schools. You have to be taught it, and it has to be taught as revealed as well. And I used to enjoy Bible study classes. It was my first, I didn't realize it then, but it was my first experience with textual criticism, which is going on to become my life. And I enjoyed the fosking around in the old books that this involved. And one day, though, Mrs. Watts made a crucial mistake. She combined her role as nature instructor and scriptural advisor and said, look, children, boys, see how good God has been to us. He's made the trees and grass to be green, the colour that's most restful to our eyes. Imagine he could have made it purple or orange, and that would be really harsh and clashing. But he's a good man, and he gave us the greenery. And I thought, I was 9, I thought, that's nonsense. I didn't know anything about chlorophyll, didn't know anything about photosynthesis, had never heard of the theory of evolution or anything like that. I just knew that she'd got it completely wrong. In fact, exactly wrong, because the eyes adapt to the vegetation, not the other way around, and to other environmental conditions too. But no one else seemed to have noticed. So I thought, well, maybe I'm nuts, or either that or they all are. But as I grew older, I found lots and lots of people have this experience.
It's a questioning mind, and you sort of assume to some extent that when people accept their faith or cleave to their faith or take it on absolutely, that the mind stops questioning.
Well, yes, that's why I find it annoying when people say you've got to respect faith. I mean, if people have to have faith, that's fine. If they want to believe that their prophet and redeemer was born without using the birth canal, or only using it as a one-way street, and was later resurrected and though apparently didn't really die, died for our sins, either did or can't make up their mind about that, fine. But I don't see why I should respect it. It seems to me that I don't have to respect someone who announces in public that he's willing to believe anything he's told.
You have a certain modicum of respect, though. You write about your 2 marriages and going along with the rituals, and that's, in effect, kind of acquiescing a bit to religious respect, isn't it?
No, if I go inside a synagogue, which it takes a lot to make me do, for a bar mitzvah, say, of friends, okay, of course I'll put on a skull cap and observe the protocols, and the same if I go to a mosque, I'll take off my shoes. It's very important as a matter of etiquette, and it's also if one believes in the multicultural ethos, to actually know what the etiquettes are.
But it's etiquette
but
rather
than... I do not respect
rather
them,
than respect for religion.
I do not respect these places, really. I mean, if I go to a synagogue, I'm going to somewhere where people pray every day, "Dear God, thank you for not making me a woman or a goy." I don't respect that.
Orthodox. Only the Orthodox.
Sure, but I mean, that's what Judaism is.
Speaking of Judaism, you have a whole chapter here about eating pig, and it's fascinating because I grew up with the notion that the Jews and people of the Muslim faith were really smart. They knew about trichinosis, and so they didn't eat pork. And here's Christopher Hitchens again kind of dismantling that myth.
Yes, that's not it at all, and trichinosis can occur in cold climates too. In fact, apparently it's more common there. That's clearly not the reason for the taboo, because when you investigate it, you find that there's a hidden pleasure involved in the eating of pig. It's something that is reserved for special occasions. It's sometimes, in some Jewish texts, it's even held out as a possibility that you can have as much pork as you want in heaven. So what it is...
No virgins, however.
No virgins. But because, as you know, with every virgin comes a mother-in-law. That's the Jewish teaching. Imagine 72 mothers-in-law lined up for you in paradise. Where was I? Oh, yes. Obviously, there's a guilty desire to eat this stuff. And the reason for the taboo, in my opinion, is that the taste of pork is reminiscent of the taste of human being. That's what we taste like. And we now know we're quite close cousins of pigs, and we can get organ transplants from them, for example, and skin transplants, things like that. We squeal a bit like them, or when they squeal, they sound a bit like us. It's to do with some remote taboo on cannibalism and human sacrifice.
This is your Orwellian background with Animal Farm, is it? Thinking
it's more, in this case, it's more the jungle. It's more Upton Sinclair.
Because this is you mentioned Upton Sinclair.
But of course, in the Muslim world, I mean, the Muslims, it's odd they should plagiarize that, of all things, from the Jews. I mean, there's a lot of plagiarism in the Islamic canon. They believe in the Virgin Mary, for example. They managed to get, whenever they borrow for the Bible, they borrow the worst bits. And they take this Jewish prejudice very literally, so that Animal Farm is still banned in almost all Muslim countries.
That chapter is kind of a porcine Valentine, by the way. I found it. You like that animal.
I'm glad you noticed that. I'm very proud of that little chapter. Why should heaven hate ham?
Well, like you, I'm since my youth very involved with texts, and I couldn't help but also noticing how much literature to you has become, well, not necessarily a surrogate, but in some ways a replacement for Scripture. Literature is sort of your Scripture without the holiness attached to it.
Thank you again for noticing that. Wherever I can, I try and illustrate moral and ethical questions by reference, say, to Dostoevsky or to George Eliot, maybe my favorite, Shakespeare, Goethe. There's much more morality and ethics in these books than there is in any of the Holy Scriptures. And I think that we're often accused, the atheist community, of sort of not having any sense of the transcendent or anything of the awe-inspiring. You know, that we're a bit arid and dry. We think of love as a chemical reaction. That idea. Not true at all. I mean, for us, there's the beauty of science. Just take a look through the Hubble telescope and see if you're not more impressed than by the burning bush. Or a page of Stephen Hawking. Or music and the beauties of consolations of philosophy. And above all, I think, the lessons, the moral and ethical lessons that are inculcated by literature. Yeah, we have plenty to offer once we turn our back on these arid, man-made, hateful texts.
Talking with Christopher Hitchens, who is the author of God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. What about that old negative affirmation? It goes back to Aristotle, and Paul Tillich said, if you say there's no God, you are saying there is a God. In other words, you're affirming through the negative.
Well, I have an example of that, a counterexample in my book. It's a lovely novel by Penelope Lively called Moon Tiger. Probably a lot of your listeners have read it. And the narrator's daughter says to her, "Mummy, are there dragons?" Mummy says, "No, there aren't." So were there ever dragons, Mummy? Well, she said, I think it's very unlikely. But if there's such a word as dragon, Mummy, this very persistent kid, we should all have children like this. If there's such a word, there must once have been dragons. Well, as you know, that's a fallacy. But it's a charming one.
I wonder, we had a guest on recently, Jeffrey Kripal, just a few days ago, in fact, who did a book on Esalen. He's chair of the Religious Studies Department at Rice University, and he makes this distinction between spirituality and religion. He calls Esalen the religion of no religion, and says, in effect, that there are many people now who give this new mantra, I would call it, I don't believe in religion, but I'm spiritual.
Sure.
You accept that, and you find that something to get your approbation?
Well, the condition that I insist upon is that it be something that has no implications for me. You see, if someone says they're a Christian, then I immediately suspect them, not of believing fatuously that they have a saviour who's going to redeem them, bad enough, but of wanting to persuade me of it too, either by instating Christianity in the law or getting it tax breaks and faith-based subsidies and all this kind of thing. They can't leave me alone. Same with Islam. They want to proselytize for it. If, let's say, prevent stem cell research being done or something of that kind, or prevent people from getting hold of contraception. If someone says, well, I'm just a spiritual person and I believe in the essence of the all is the Godhead of the true and I hear burblings from the beyond, fine, as long as they leave me alone. But even the Buddhists don't quite do this.
They're not great proselytizers, or are they?
Well, not exactly, no, but there are some ways in which the Buddhism isn't a religion. But you notice, of course, yet again, here it comes. Buddha is born from a slit in his mother's side. Can't somehow go near the female genitalia. There's this same shared disgust that they have for women and for sex, in common with all this. One of the most nauseating things about all religion. The ideology of Zen, I've discussed this in my book, was the official ideology of Japanese militarism under the Hirohito fascist regime. It was how they trained their soldiers. There's a wonderful book called Zen at War by a former Buddhist adept called Brian Victoria. Actually, he still is a Buddhist priest. I recommend it. The military dictatorship in Burma now is officially Buddhist, for example. No, if once you start surrendering reason and clustering around some Godhead type figure, I can tell you, you sort of set your watch, bad things will start happening. By the way, what does the Buddhist say to the hot dog vendor?
What does the Buddha say to the hot dog vendor?
Thank you. He says, make me one with everything. Wait, there's part two. And the Buddhist then hands over a $20 bill, starts to munch, waits for a bit, and then says, what about my change? And the vendor says, change comes only from within.
There is a brilliant pun in here, which I'm not going to say on the air, about No Child Left Behind, but I'll tantalize people by at least alluding to that. Talking to Christopher Hitchens, and we can talk with you. Join us toll-free, 866-733-6786. Toll-free, 866-733-6786, or by email, forum@kqed.org. This is Forum. I'm Michael Krasny. We're talking this hour with Christopher Hitchens. His book is God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. I'm looking at some of your emails here. I'll try to get to them in the course of the hour, but just this one that came on the top of the batch from David says, Hitchens wants to be the savior of humanity, but what he really needs to do is to mind his own business and leave everyone alone. I'll drink my wine and read the Gospels. You smoke your cigarettes and read your magazine. That's fine. It's sort of the inverse of what you were saying about it.
Yeah, that sounds like a reasonable coexistence. Yeah, I wouldn't mind some of the wine.
Reciprocity, yes, I'm sure you would. And by the way, do you have an Epicurean sense of what wines you prefer at this stage of your... Just curious to know, what wine do you prefer drinking?
Do you know what that movie Sideways made me think, what is this Pinot Noir fuss? I better, because I was a sort of fairly regular Merlot imbiber. So now I tend to ask people what Pinot they have about their person.
Sales of Merlot went down terribly after that movie.
I like to think also that I'm not influenced by product placement in movies or anything like that, but I thought, well, I'm going to see what the fuss is about, and now I think I could say I knew.
Is there a sense...
By the way, why is the film called Sideways? If anyone can call in and tell me, I'd be thrilled.
I think it's when he drives the car, isn't it? When he goes sideways.
Is that it?
I thought that was sort of the metaphor. You're going sideways.
I couldn't...
What I gleaned from it. But
I usually can work out why films are called.
It was a bit obscure, yeah. Get the emails on that, no doubt. By the way, if you have an explanation, it's forum@kqed.org, and we'll go to your calls in just a moment. I want to ask you, though, just before I go to the calls here... We were talking about Richard Dawkins, and although, like you, I'm an admirer of his, I think in some ways, and I've even said this to him, said, Richard, maybe some people might think you doth protest too much when it comes to religion, and also that he's found Darwin as a substitution in a kind of absolutist sense for what religion might have provided. And I was thinking, wondering just of sort of tossing the same question at you. What would you say to those who say you doth protest too much? It's maybe like you were talking about with the pig. There's some aversion here that's based on something else, perhaps, that maybe you want to deny. It's very Freudian type of thing. And have you substituted people like Orwell and Stephen Jay Gould and maybe Darwin and Nietzsche?
And Thomas Jefferson and Thomas Paine, subject of my next book. Somebody wrote to me yesterday to say, did I ever remember saying in an interview about 10 years ago that no, I wouldn't write a book about atheism? And the reason I gave was there were already quite enough perfectly good texts making the case. I don't remember saying this, actually, but I can imagine having done so. The difference is that in the last few years, I would say the last 15, since the fatwa against Salman Rushdie in 89, it's a bit more than 15 now, really direct intervention by theocracy into our lives. Ayatollah Khomeini offering money to kill a novelist in London, pretty frontal attack on what I think of as Enlightenment and First Amendment values. And then last year, the Danish cartoons, where, if you remember, campaigned to destroy and sabotage the Danish economy, to kill random Danes, to burn their embassies, because the Danish government refused to censor the press in Copenhagen on cartoons. Not one American newspaper would reprint them, either to show what the fuss was about or out of solidarity with the Danes. Not one, except for a little magazine I write for, an atheist magazine called Free Inquiry, which was removed from the magazine rack at Borders Books as a result. And the State Department, when asked for comment, condemned not the arson at Danish embassies, but the cartoons. I thought, okay, you can't say this is the work of a fringe nutbag group. It seems to have won a clear and complete victory right across American society and beaten the arguments for free speech without a shot being fired.
But is it...
I take it very seriously.
Is it a sort of subtextually, is it a respect for religion, or is it just acquiescence and fear?
Well, it was disgracefully a bit of both, because this religion, which I don't think we should be respecting anyway, has as its backup, if you don't respect us, we'll kill you.
But you're talking about the extreme form of that religion.
But I'm talking about an easy victory that it won right across the United States. By being extreme, yes, but that's why it isn't fringe. You see what I mean? And the Vatican, when asked to comment, said the same. We condemn the cartoons. Not the arson, not the sabotage, not the murder, not the intimidation. So, no, what I'm trying to do is stiffen the spine of the secular forces and say, look, this is now important. It's in your life too. It's not happening on another planet. The same lesson we should have learned from the Taliban. People who think like that can ruin our lives too, as well as their own country and their own culture.
Find out what our callers have to say. Graham, you're first. Good morning. Welcome.
Oh, hello there. Thanks for having me on here.
Sure.
I'm from Northern Ireland and consider myself...
I would never have been able to tell that.
Yeah. Well, you would, Mr. Hitchens, but many others in this country think I'm American, unfortunately.
Probably when you go back to the old sod, they think you're a Yank because you sound like
That's right. It's a terrible dilemma. I'm sure Mr. Hitchens has a similar situation. But I consider myself to be a secular humanist, and I've seen many of the things which religion, or things which are done in the name of religion, which are terrible. But I think that there's a mistake in the kind of attack that Mr. Hitchens and Professor Dawkins make on religion, because they consider religion to be primarily a question of belief or knowledge about the universe. I mean, Professor Dawkins' work in particular seems to see religion as a direct rival to science, scientific explanation of how the universe is. But it seems to me that religion is much more than that, and it's also a way of being in the world. It's an attitude towards the world. It involves things like mystery, love, humility, solidarity. And I think when you reduce it just to an epistemology, then it's easy to attack it on that basis, but there's much more to it. And another thing which religion does is the Bible, these texts that Mr. Hitchens has a problem with, are also literature, which he vaunts as a source of value. So the whole Bible is not just Leviticus, right? So
no, you're quite right, and I accept that correction. In fact, in my book, I say that without the King James version of the Bible and the Cranmer Prayer Book, in particular, my own knowledge of literature would be incomplete. Actually, anybody's would be, because if you don't know and to some extent esteem those books,
Western literature.
Yeah. You couldn't read Shakespeare. Of course you couldn't read Milton, more or less by
Malcolm
definition.
X thought King James wrote Shakespeare. I don't know if you knew that's in his autobiography.
I didn't know that.
Theorizes that as opposed to Christopher Marlowe.
But there are bits of the Book of Job, for example, man is born to trouble as the sparks fly upward. Once you've ever heard that or read it, it's not going to leave your head ever till your last hour. And so I think it's assimilable to what I say, that if you're interested in mystery, solidarity, the other things you were invoking, you can find them all in literature and philosophy and music. You don't need to go to Bronze Age Palestinian morality tales for any of this. But you're wrong, I'm afraid, and Dawkins is right in saying that religion and science are necessarily opposed. If religion has any claim at all to make for itself, it's that it claims to understand that there's a purpose in the universe directed at us, and that it can tell us what that purpose is. Right? Well, that's a false explanation of reality, and false explanations of reality are often not just mistaken; they lead people into making terrible mistakes.
Let me thank you, Graham, for your call. We're going to get as many of you on as we can with Christopher Hitchens. David, good morning.
Good morning. I've been a great follower of Mr. Hitchens for many years and agree with him on many things and disagree with a few. I probably disagree on this one. And here's a quandary I'd pose for you, Mr. Hitchens. You're speaking, if I can make a funny pun, I hope, you're preaching to the choir in San Francisco. This is the most secular, atheist kind of a community one could practically find on planet Earth and ever in history. But what's interesting is that you've been a very strong supporter of the Iraq War, as am I.
David, forgive me for saying this, but we are not only heard in San Francisco, we are heard in all the surrounding environs and now all over the world. So
okay, well,
let's just factor that in.
You get the point,
yeah.
Right. So the point is that Mr. Hitchens has been a very strong supporter of the war in Iraq, a lot on humanitarian grounds, opposing horrific dictatorships and control of authoritarian and dictatorial figures and so on. What's amazing is that in America, at least, the secular left has been the most opposed to the war, and the conservative religious folks have been the most supportive. And I find that quite ironic, and I hope you will take that as a little bit of a sign that perhaps religion's not the only evil in the world, that apathy, that secular dogmatism, and other factors can also be terrifically horrific, for other people.
I know just what you mean. As a matter of fact, though, most of the religious forces around the world and in America were opposed to the removal of Saddam Hussein. The Catholic Church more or less officially was. So was the Church of England. The Methodist Church, which is the one the President belongs to, very strongly against. And of that Christian right of which we hear so much, actually most of them not very interested in Iraq. It isn't a popular issue among Republican core voters and never has been, the Iraq question. However, so I differ with you slightly on that. On the whole, the religious utterly failed the Iraqi people. They said, we don't care if you go on being owned by a psychopathic dictator. The secular left has a problem not just with Iraq, but it's had a problem ever since the rise of Islamism began, political Islamism, of appearing to make excuses for it, to euphemize it, in other words. You hear in a lot of left talk about the jihad a certain tone of voice, how shall I describe it, as if these people were promoting some sort of liberation theology, that bin Laden is in some sense an expression of protest against poor conditions in the third world. I think it's because Islam is identified on the whole with brown-skinned countries that subliminally some people on the left feel it must be a religion of the oppressed, whereas in fact it's the religion of the Saudi Arabian royal family. In particular, the Wahhabi version that threatens us is preached and promulgated by people who are extremely rich and extremely privileged and exploitative, to say the least. But that's been an argument I've had not just over Iraq, but over things like the fatwa against Salman Rushdie, the Taliban, and indeed the events of September 11th itself.
Apropos of that, and let me thank the caller.
There are people, in other words, who say if only there was a Palestinian state, this wouldn't have happened. People who are that stupid.
Here's Hugh, who says, it's always refreshing to hear Mr. Hitchens articulate the vision of secular democratic values. However, given his atheist and rationalist values, it seems odd to me that he feels so comfortable siding with the Bush administration on Iraq. Are we really to believe that the most religious president in recent history is interested in bringing secular democracy to the Middle East?
The president isn't the most religious in recent history. That honor would have to go to Jimmy Carter, who's now, for some reason, a hero to a lot of liberals. I cannot understand why. In his most recent book on the Israel-Palestine question, he says the problem with Israel is it's become too secular, that it's turned away from God. So we have someone who was president of the United States who thinks everything in the Middle East would be better if Israel was more orthodox. Can you imagine the stupidity of that? With the president, I think there's a paradoxical position. You identify my position as paradoxical or as ironic. It's ironic to be Bush and to have to hope, as he does have to hope, that secular forces emerge in Iraq and Afghanistan. The whole axis and fulcrum of American policy depends upon the emergence of such forces, and wherever we find them, the Republican administration tries to nurture them. If that's an irony at their expense, I think it's a good one. Every member of the 82nd Airborne could be a believing snake handler, for all I know, but the fact is they're guarding the frontiers of secularism against religious barbarism, and that's the point to keep your eye on.
There's another listener who says, because there are rewards, Hitchens devalues Christian good works as devalued altruism. In that particular example, he presumes that Christians do the good work specifically to get the reward and assumes that Christians are looking to get credit for altruism. This assumes that Christians are looking to get credit for altruism, and this kind of leap deserves challenge. Example, Christians may well choose to be what God has asked them to be with a different purpose in mind. Jesus said, and this is from Matthew, in the same way, let your light shine before men that they may see your good deeds and praise your Father in heaven.
Well, doesn't that make my point for me? People want their lights to be admired now.
But there may be altruism just based on wanting to do good deeds without thinking there's an after reward.
Sure.
I think that's what he's implying.
Well, then why call it Christian? Why on earth call that Christian? I mean, the most famous story, it's in Luke, as you'll know, sir, is the parable of the Good Samaritan, which is a man who goes out of his way to help a fellow creature in awful distress and to express solidarity with him. Well, this story is quite clearly not a Christian story because Jesus of Nazareth, if he ever existed, is talking about someone who may or may not have existed, but who's in the past, so clearly wasn't motivated by Christianity to stop by the side of the road and help someone who was near death. You don't need any supernatural justification for doing that. I like to give blood, for example. I don't do it as often as I should, but it gives me pleasure because I like to help out the health service, as it were. And I don't lose a pint because I get it back again in a few hours, a nice sort of cup of tea. But someone gains a pint. That's a positively pleasurable transaction for me. What more do I have to invoke? What's the Gospel of Matthew got to do with it?
I'm going to go to more calls. Just a quick thing, though. When you were 9 years old, I think you noticed in this reconfiguration of the cosmos or whatever was going on in your mind that if God could heal, or if Jesus could heal, and change blindness, then why not just do away with blindness utterly and entirely? If he could make the blind man see, then why not get rid of blindness or something along those lines?
Yes.
Which is an interesting axiomatic way of seeing.
I mean, there's got to be suffering, of course, because otherwise we wouldn't have anything to learn from. But I perhaps wasn't as aware of that when I was 9 as I would be now. But there seems to be quite a lot of unnecessary, needless suffering that doesn't teach us anything. Except probably that these events are random, which is the most important thing to understand, that we are not, in fact, the center of the universe. The universe doesn't know we're here. As Auden puts it in his lovely poem, The More Loving One, looking up at the stars, I know quite well that for all they care, I can go to hell.
Yeah. Well, let's go to more calls. It's Milo's turn from Palo Alto. Good morning.
Good morning. I wanted to comment on Mr. Hitchens' allusion to the similarity between swine flesh and human flesh. That's a delightfully ironic but somewhat poetic rendition. Marvin Harris has written a couple of books. One is called Cannibals and Kings, The Origins of Culture. The other was called Cows, Pigs, Wars, and Witches, that shows the ecological basis for the taboo of swine flesh among desert peoples and the taboo of cattle flesh among the Hindus. Those traditions are consistent with their ecological needs. Thank you.
Well, with the Hindu, my understanding is that there was a time when there was a danger during a drought that people would, a drought and a famine, that a large number of people in India would just kill and eat all their cows, which would mean that the next famine would be much worse. And so it was decreed by some intelligent Brahmins that the cows be made sacred so that this slaughter wouldn't devastate the economy. I don't know if that's the ecological example you have in mind. With the way you can find in archaeology in Palestine whether an old settlement is Jewish or not is, which all archaeologists do anyway when they go to a village, is they go to the rubbish dump, because that's where you find all the most intriguing stuff, what people throw away, and you dig down through the layers. And in some hill towns you find there are no pig bones, and then you know there are other reasons will confirm it, but that was a Jewish settlement. It goes back a long way. And some you'll find that there are, which means that people were eating them but not dying of trichinosis.
You know, when you write about, for example, Islam having their rules against eating pig being derivative from the Jewish religion, and all of these kind of cross-cultural derivative, sort of like intertextuality. I mean, the Gilgamesh myth going into the Noah story is a wonderful example of that.
Yes.
Or the story of the Buddha walking across water, and the story, of course, of Christ walking across water. I've heard religious theorists say that what these things prove is that there are universal myths that have to do with the foundation of religion, a kind of a Baha'i faith that is underlying all religions and brings them together with a uniform notion that we should love, being the very precept, really, that all religions are based on.
Well, people sometimes like to say that God is love, though the corollary doesn't seem to hold, that love is God. That doesn't seem to make the same kind of sense, does it?
Unless it's Eros.
I should have said that. If, for example, that's true, then how much does it explain? I mean, we need to at least respect, if not like each other, in order to survive. Some people wouldn't, quote Auden again, we must love one another or die. You don't need a supernatural authority for this. If you're trying to tell me, for example, that the Jewish people didn't know till they got to Sinai that murder and theft and perjury were wrong, then I will reply to you that you can't be serious, because if they had thought those things were okay, we would never have heard of this tribe. It wouldn't have made it. It would have died out. They knew it's an insult to say that they needed to be told that by God. These things are innate in us. Religion gets its morality from us. Confucius says something like the Golden Rule before Rabbi Hillel does. And Rabbi Hillel says it long before Jesus of Nazareth does. And Jesus of Nazareth makes a very strenuous condition. He says you're supposed to love your neighbor as yourself. Well, you can't do that. And you probably shouldn't.
Especially if your neighbor has a loud stereo system.
For example, your neighbor may not deserve it, but it's not in us to do that, to love others as much as we love ourselves and our loved ones. But if you make such a strenuous commandment on people, you can always be sure that you can catch them out in sin, because they'll always be backsliding and falling short. So they're permanently guilty. It's very handy for that.
I'm getting as many interpretations of the title Sideways here as there are for biblical scripture, by the way. You want to just hear a few of them before we go on to more calls?
Please.
Storing bottles on their side to preserve the cork seal, says one listener. I believe the answer is partly to do with how you properly store wine on its side. And then another listener says, it's called sideways because wine bottles are traditionally stored sideways. A lot of those. And then sideways, the title is about baby boomers going nowhere, up or down, just sideways, existential reference to midlife crisis. I always thought sideways referred to the main character's life trajectory, neither growth nor disintegration, just stasis, resolution by the end of the movie uncertain, and so they go.
Fine. Thank you. Thank you very much.
And, there are some about drunkenness as well, having to do with walking sideways, as you might imagine. And we'll go over to San Jose and welcome Jay onto the air. Good morning.
Hi, Michael.
Hi.
It's always a privilege to listen to your show.
Thank you.
And I want to thank Mr. Hitchens, because I see some very good comments from him on the show. And I wanted to ask him that does he think that, religion came at a time when there was some confusion in the society, and, around 2,000 years or 5,000 years back, people came up with ideas that helped to streamline those confusions with some common ideology that was acceptable to the majority of the people at that time. And now it has probably become irrelevant because those things no longer exist. It was a mindset of 2,500 years ago. Some of it may still be relevant, as is the case with any other theory that we can come up with, and or more generalized concepts. And at the end of the day, it's becoming more and more irrelevant, because otherwise how could you explain someone sending their own children to blow into pieces and kill others for knowing fully that they would be, blown into pieces by doing that? How could anyone justify that?
Well, I think you're right. I mean, we are, as animals, gifted with the need to find patterns and to ask questions and to try and arrive at explanations. We're fated to do this. And even now, quite well-educated people, if they don't have enough information, will prefer a conspiracy theory to no theory at all when they're looking for an explanation, and that's to be expected. Religion is born at a time when the species is in its infancy and when we know practically nothing, when we don't know that there are germs. We have no germ theory of disease, so outbreaks of leprosy or plague, are thought to be some kind of a curse. There's no possible way of finding out what's causing them. We don't know that we live on a cooling planet that used to be molten, and thus that there will be earthquakes and volcanoes and tidal waves. These are always thought of as acts of God, often as punishment.
Didn't the late Reverend Falwell believe that about AIDS, in fact?
And then, yes, of course, someone as primitive as Falwell, still, because he's a prisoner of this childhood of our species, as well as being a bigot and a crook and various other things of that description, yes, was persuadable of things like that. We don't know that the Earth is round. We don't know that it goes around the sun. We have no idea about planetary revolution. So we're still stuck with the explanations that came to us first and that got consecrated as divine, and thus are harder to flush out of our systems. But the effort really has to be made now.
Talking with Christopher Hitchens. His book is God is Not Great, How Religion Poisons Everything. A couple of funny emails here. Is Christopher worried that in 200 years he'll be the Godhead for the cult of non-believers? And I like this kind of juxtaposition. A listener who says, if we are to be judged by the consequences of our actions, you regret your support of the Iraq War despite the eloquent reasons you present. Hundreds of people brutally killed each day. And then after that, he says, what's your preferred brand of whiskey?
The best blend whiskey ever made, I think, is Johnny Walker Black, by a long way. And the upgrades, by the way, aren't worth it. But it's better than the red, but stop there. The Johnny Walker Blue and so on is it's an affectation.
I don't know if we want to open
when
the
you say
Iraq
hundreds
box,
when you say hundreds of people are being killed in the Iraq War, you speak the unvarnished truth, but they're being murdered by the other side in that war. The parties of God, and that's what we have to prevent Iraq from falling under.
God, I love Mr. Hitchens' presumption that everyone Christian is interested in converting him and that he just wants to be left alone when he himself is clearly proselytizing atheism. I guess proselytizing is only okay when it's your own beliefs. And he's clearly not cognizant of the huge swath of Christianity in this country that's not interested in converting him. Some Christian sects, very explicitly do not condone or countenance proselytizing. Christianity is not a monolith. It's incredibly varied, and Christianity in itself is on part of the larger spectrum of religion.
Well, it's true there is a spiritual supermarket among Christians, but you make two mistakes. One is I don't say they want to convert me. I say they want to change the conditions in which I live. It is Christian advocates who say stem cell research, for example, should not be allowed. They won't. It's not that they won't take part in it themselves. It's they won't let anyone else do it either. That used to be for a long time the same with things like contraception and abortion. Not that we forbid people of our congregation to do it, but we forbid anyone who we can reach from doing it, whether they take our theology seriously or not. Finally, it's a little inexpensive of you to say I'm proselytizing for atheism. You can't convert someone to a mode of thinking that says that skepticism and free inquiry are the main desiderata, that there should be no barriers to the argument of any evidence or any witness, that things proceed by conflict and by dialectics and by collisions between theories and reality.
Reason.
There's no dogma to proselytize for there.
It's reason. I mean, you want to convert people to reason and rational thinking, don't you? In fact, here's a listener who has a PhD in biology and is working on a PhD in theology named Oliver, who says, central claim of a materialist ideology like Hitchens might be summarized as the opinion that only scientific evidence is permissible and leads to the truth. The statement is nonsensical simply because as a metaphysical statement that is outside the realm of scientific testing. It would render itself useless if it were true. How would Hitchens deal with such a paradoxical position, not unlike Epimenides' liar's paradox? Also, sorry for beating a dead horse, reading any text, biblical or not, is a hermeneutical exercise, and to read the Bible as literal as Hitchens does is, of course, naive.
Well, then, I don't see how you can say it's the Word of God. But maybe he doesn't. I mean, because people then, they start to back away. Even in Episcopal services, you know, in the milder Church of England form, they read a selected portion, usually from each testament, and then at the end they say, this is the word of the Lord. Now, you either believe that or you don't. If you don't, I'm not sure what you do believe. I can level with you. I can say, and you can test my opinion because I give it to you, I don't believe it. But I can't write a different book for every different believer. I can only say what the religions actually are, what they do say, how their texts do in fact license the fundamentalist interpretation. They do mean what they say and say what they mean, and how dangerous and indeed poisonous that is.
Christopher Hitchens, even in a foxhole, you won't get him changing on this score. Always delighted to have you. As Michael Kinsley says, you always engage us intellectually, and I thank you for that.